Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Nabiyla Risfa. You can call me Nabiyla. I actually cannot see whether there are actual people or not in the room, but I hope there are. Like there are people there.
Yes, it's off the ground from Vincent's presentation.
Yeah. So I'm a labor law lecturer from Faculty of Law, Universitas Gadjah Mada, but I'm also a PhD student in Queen Mary University of London. But now I'm currently in Indonesia. So now it's actually almost 2 o'clock in the morning. So I'm so sorry if I look sleepy because it's very late at night. But I will try my best to present my paper. Today I will be presenting about searching for collective action, finding new types of resistance in Indonesia gig economy. And I think like this tied quite nicely with the previous presentation, especially with the previous presentation, because there are some of this presentation will also talk about the new types of resistance in social media that are done by Indonesia's gig worker. So just to recap a little bit, I will be presenting about my presentation highlight will be talking first about resistance in gig economy in general, like the literature review regarding resistance in gig economy. And then I will be talking about gig economy in Indonesia, because I don't know whether you're familiar or not with how gig economy works in Indonesia. And then afterwards, I will start talking about the new types of resistance that we found in Indonesia's gig economy. They're talking about small communities, wildcat strikes, and social media protests that are tied quite nicely with the previous presentation. And then there is actually a discussion regarding whether traditional union is still relevant or not when we're talking about these new types of resistance from gig workers. So just to a little bit talking about resistance in gig economy, when we're talking about gig economy in the beginning, like not too long ago, probably like about around 10 years ago, when we start talking about gig economy in general, there are a tendency of an argument that saying that gig workers are not organizable and therefore could not form collective resistance because they're working individually, they're working not in an employment relationship. And since workers' resistance and organizing are usually drawn from the workplace, something that gig workers do not have. So the first argument that the first few years argument regarding resistance in gig economy keeps saying that, well, it's not possible to have some sort of resistance in gig economy. However, we all know that there is a growing resistance and organization among gig workers all over the world that has been documented, from 2016 delivery worker strikes in London to Foodora worker strikes in Italy, Uber IPO strikes in US, etc. There are tons of examples of gig workers resistance that are happening all over the world. So this paper actually aimed to understand the similar growth of resistance among gig workers in Indonesia and looking at the similar and different contexts of resistance that are happening. And to understand that, I have to tell you a little bit about gig economy in Indonesia. So the two major players when we're talking about gig economy in Indonesia, especially when we're talking about on-demand gig economy, so like locally types gig economy, the one that you need to work locally, not like just through the internet. There are two major local players, Gojek and Grab. So it's not like the name that you know internationally, like Uber or delivery or stuff, but both of the biggest players in Indonesia's gig economy is actually a local companies called Gojek and then Grab. Gojek claimed to employ around 1.5 million drivers, while Grab claimed to employ around 2 million drivers around Indonesia. And Indonesia is quite big. So even though this seems like a big number, the number in comparison to the number of workforce in Indonesia, it's still like around 2 or 3% of the overall workforce in Indonesia. And Grab in Indonesia itself was actually merged with Uber, who left Indonesian market in 2018 because they cannot compete with these local companies. So different from most of the on-demand platforms in the West, I use the terms West, even though like it's not actually the West, but like different with most of the on-demand platforms that used to be talked about, both Gojek and Grabs are actually a super app. It means that they have one platforms, they have one application that provides so many different services, from ride-hailing services, both for motorcycle and car, and their main services is actually started from motorcycle ride-hailing. And then they also have food delivery, they have courier delivery, they previously even have like several different service delivery, all comes from one application. They even have their own e-money from the application. So everything comes from this two super apps that a lot of Indonesian are depend on. And Indonesia has high level of unemployment, informality, and precarious workers prior to gig era. Therefore, workforce and government are very excited about the gig economy's prospect when it started happening. And gig economy, therefore, gig platforms in Indonesia are operating in, until now, are still operating in institutional void. Some of the main services are even clearly violating Indonesian law. For example, our transportation law is banning motorcycles treated as public transportation, but the government seems to tolerate the violation due to the high demand of these services. And those different variety of services in one platform makes it even harder to regulate, and therefore they're still working in an institutional void until now. But then this does not mean that the workers is not resisting, because sorry, it seems like I missed one slide. But this in these past few years, there is a big chunk, there is a big transformation of resistance happening in Indonesia, and we map that there are three types of new resistance that are not involving the traditional types of resistance. And this is because the main engine of the resistance of gig economy are this gig workers community. So gig workers in Indonesia are now usually organizing using a small geographically based community. These communities are not legal trade union, but they're more informal communities that stick together due to similar bidding location or similar background. So usually you have female gig workers that they have their own community. You have a different gig workers in like several different locations that they have their own community. And it usually consisted of a small number of people, like around 15 until 75 members, and they're bonded into like shelters or base camp. And researchers call this as a mutual aid-based communities, because these small communities started as a support system on their day-to-day work activities, such as helping fellow driver when they have an accident, or sharing updates regarding new scheme in the platform or stuff like that. But then when the decline of earnings started, like there is a new wave of decline of earning, worse working conditions that started felt within the gig workers. This community became the main engine in the protest, and this started the new wave of wildcat strikes that are done by gig workers in Indonesia. Wildcat strike itself is more into like non-legitimate and non-institutionalized collective action by workers. And the pandemic actually opened the wave of wildcat strikes in Indonesian gig workers, with around 24 protests carried out during 2020 and 28 strikes during 2021, and so far around 19 protests so far in 2022. So the main issue is basically the same on these strikes, is basically the same. The first is the decline of earnings due to the percentage of tariff and the overall working conditions that are getting worse in most of these platforms. Most of these strikes haven't really moved the issue towards more foundational aspects, such as problem with employment relationships, the issues that we heard a lot in the West, but it's not really something that are being concerned, at least in the beginning of these wildcat strikes. And they never really bonded workers from different platforms together. So when they do the wildcat strikes, it usually like coming from the same services or the same platforms. They don't actually like do it together. And this is when I say that it's starting to tied nicely with the previous one, because lots of workers are also using a social media as their new forms of resistance, because social media are used to maintain gig workers communities. So the small communities that I talked previously usually have their own social media. It can be Facebook, it can be Twitter. They're most likely using Twitter because it's like more talkative. And it used to you're using the social media to share problems related with their working condition to people at large. For example, they're posting screenshot of their income. This is an example of that. The percentage cut by the platforms, how long they're working, and they even mention the platform social media. So they mention Gojek, they mention Grab, and everything. But then an interesting thing happened, because we see that there are two contradictory sides of account when we're looking at this gig workers account in social media. Those who maintain positive sites working in a platforms, and those who keep criticizing the account. I mean, like criticizing the platform. So there are two different types of account. So this example on the right is an example that giving a positive sides of the platforms. And if it's interesting to see that the account with most followers are actually an account who use their platform to share a positive sides of the platforms, the work, instead of the one who criticize the work, because they're seen as those who share tips and tricks to get better in the job instead of just complaining about the job. So people are more flocking around the account that's sharing a positive sides of the gig workers. So this is actually quite interesting. And the question that we also come up when we're doing this research is, where is the traditional union? Where is the union in these new types of resistance? Because like in the wildcat strikes, there is no union that back them up. There is no actual big union in Indonesia that are backing this new types of resistance on the gig workers. And it seems like there are two reasons why traditional union is not being part of gig workers resistance in Indonesia. The first one is the skepticism of the workers itself, and then there is also a reluctancy from the union, because the problem is the union density rate in Indonesia is generally scarce, like only around 6% in 2012. There is no latest data available. And gig workers' position as independent contractor are making them feel unfitted with the trade union styles in Indonesia. And in the other hand, the big union in Indonesia has not been very accommodating with the gig workers' concern, because the narrative that they're pushing are solely about how to make the working relationship become an employment relationship, since this is the issues that they're familiar with, because most of the trade union coming from an employment relationship, of course, but it seems like this issue has not really been seen. Not many gig workers think that this is an important issue to talk about now, because the one that they feel more important is just like their income. Like they only don't want the tariff to be cut, and etc. And this is why those two, the idea of that the big union push toward the workers does not really relatable with the one that they actually want. But then the problem is, when the traditional union is not involved, it's also correlated with our other findings that the protest that has been happening, at least in this past 3 years, has not yet been very successful, because like the wildcat strikes usually come in like very short-handed. Most of the platforms say that they're unable to grant the workers' demand due to competition with other platforms, and there has not been any progress from the government as well, and then the business is just back as usual. And these protests have a tendency to be short and abrupt, as they were not backed with resource. They don't really have a resource, as in the resource that the union has, as well as an organizational technique, just like what the union has. So some gig workers are actually looking at this problem as well, and they currently starting their own labor union. There is one, they're starting to make the one called Seroja, or Indonesian Online Drivers Union, with around 7,000 members so far that they claim of. And traditional labor union have also started to try more engage into this organization of platform drivers. There are big unions such as transportation workers union that try to reach the gig workers, even though it can only reach small parts of the workers so far and with a certain services only. So the primary preliminary conclusions that we have so far is that the workers' resistance, the gig workers' resistance in Indonesia, just like what happened in the other part of the world, is also happening. And in Indonesian context, the small informal workers community has become a backbone of gig workers collective action in Indonesia. They are organizing, this small gig workers community are organizing protests, wildcat strikes, also using social media to share their problems related with their working conditions and engage with broader audience. And unions, like traditional union, are left in gig workers resistance due to two major reasons that I talked previously, which is the skepticism from the gig workers and the reluctancy of the trade union as well. However, because of this, probably because one of the reasons is because there is no backup on the union, the protest has not been going, that has been going around for around 3 years, has not been very successful. It has tendency to be short and abrupt, since they were not really backed with the resource and necessary organizational technique, just like what the union has. So we thought that there is a mutualism that actually can be built within gig workers and trade union. If the act of resistance of Indonesian gig workers wants to move forward, we think that there is a possibility that this mutualism needs to be built, because labor union might need to work out a way to be relevant in gig workers resistance, and gig workers resistance might also needs to be like looking at the possibility to engage more with the trade union, with their resource, because they have like the resource and also the organizational technique that might be able to back their collective actions to be like stronger. Because if it's not, then as far as we can see, there hasn't been like any progress on the workers' protection on the sides of the gig workers in Indonesia. So because my time is almost up, I'll just end it in here. Thank you very much.